Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this summer seminar edition. Is it still summer? Yeah, just barely. From PDCHR, Professional Development Consortium of Hampton Roads. And our special partner today is the American Society for Quality, Section 1128, right here in Tidewater, so our little neck of the woods. Just a quick introduction. Professional Development Consortium of Hampton Roads exists as a 501c3 nonprofit. We are an educator of people who run membership associations such as professional societies, civic leagues, fraternal and sororal orders, basically any group of people that gather around a common interest or a common practice. We are totally focused on offering tips and tricks and trading secrets on how to lead in this weird little environment. So that's what we're all about. Most of our events are free. We do have a conference coming up in the middle of October. It costs a little bit more than free, but everything else, it's like it's on the house. So just invest your time and stay with us. So with this, I'd like to say again, thank you for being here, and I'd also like to thank all our partners from ASQ1128. We'll be hearing from three folks today, and the first person we'll be hearing from is Lucy King. So before Lucy starts her presentation, hi Lucy, she's also going to share a little bit of information about ASQ 1128 and kind of what they're up to, and then she'll get us rolling and talking about some quality techniques, just like everybody else will be today, that may be applicable to your leadership journey. So with that, let me turn it over to Lucy. Lucy, who needs to unmute herself, Lucy.
Oh, good morning, everyone. My name is Lucy King, and I'm the nominations chair of ASQ Tidewater, Section 1128. ASQ stands for the American Society for Quality, and ASQ provides the quality community with training, professional certifications, and knowledge to a vast network of members of the global quality community. For those of you who are already members, I would like to announce that Tricia Holpen is our new chair, and I'm very grateful to her for stepping up to fill the position. If there are any questions about ASQ, please stop us and ask. I will put some links in the chat for you in case you're curious about ASQ. And ASQ members will earn 0.5 recertification units for attending today's event. So let me put this in the chat real quick. All right. And if there are no questions about ASQ, I will move on to my presentation. All right. So today I'll be talking about the King Constraint Optimization Matrix, or King COP matrix for short. We'll start with the context of this tool within the King Lean Six Sigma wheel, and then we'll get into the basics of the theory of constraints, and then talk about the tool itself, the King Constraint Optimization Matrix, and then I'll show you some examples as time allows at the end. All right, so context. So the King Lean Six Sigma wheel is a 10-element diagram that represents the entire Lean Six Sigma system, adding roles, improvement opportunity discovery, project selection and prioritization, team management, and project management to complement the DMAIC cycle. The King Constraint Optimization Matrix is used during the improve phase of the wheel to reduce bottlenecks. Also shown is where the other distilled Lean Six Sigma tools would be used in relation to the wheel. So there's the other 9 tools that are not going to be talked about today, but that's where they are. All right, so the theory of constraints. Eli Goldratt documented his theory of constraints in the book The Goal in 1984. The theory of constraints aims to minimize bottlenecks in a process. Improvement project teams can use this tool during the improve phase of the project when there are process flow problems and bottlenecks to be addressed. So how does it work? The theory of constraints has 5 conceptual steps in its cycle. And the first one highlighted here is to identify the constraints. These are process steps that lie along the critical path and hold up process outputs if they're not operating efficiently. Then you would exploit the constraint. And to do that, you would maximize the productivity of the constraint step by adding stations or buffer work in progress inventory in front of it. The third step in the theory of constraints is to subordinate all else to the constraint. So you would revisit process steps leading up to the constraint step to make sure they are productive enough to keep the constraint step busy. Eliminate any other distractions that would hinder the constraint step's productivity. Step number 4 is to elevate the constraint performance. The constraint step performance may become optimized to the point that is no longer the biggest constraint step in the process. Then the organization would move on to the next constraint step to address it in the same way. So the last step is to repeat for the next constraint. The theory of constraint cycle would start over for constraint step B, working within the framework of what was done to optimize constraint step A, so as not to undo the efforts towards constraint step B. All right, so the tool associated with the theory of constraints. So the theory of constraints, you can see, is a concept, but it's not something that you can actively use as a tool. So the King Constraint Optimization Matrix is a tool that turns the theory of constraints into an actionable matrix that can be filled out and used to systematically minimize or eliminate bottlenecks. The matrix uses the 5-step theory of constraint cycle, but also considers multiple constraints and multiple rounds of improvement. Improvement project teams can use this tool during the improve phase of the project when bottlenecks are the problem to be addressed. So how does this tool work? Well, for one, it has adjustable size. The matrix shown is adjustable in that it contains 6 columns, but more columns may be added to the right for each round of improvement. The overall constraint, the cell in the upper left corner, is used to indicate an overall constraint such as 24 hours in a day, a fixed budget, total square footage of workspace, customer demand, etc., that all other activities and constraints must work within. Then you would list out your constraints. The top portion of the table has a row for each constraint. The itemized constraints are subject to the overall constraint. You would insert rows as needed to represent each constraint, and they should be listed in order of largest constraint to smallest constraint. All right, so you remember the diagram with the circles on it had those 5 steps for the theory of constraints. And here we have them listed as a row for each one. Identify constraints, exploit the constraint, subordinate all else to the constraint, elevate constraint performance, and repeat for the next constraint. Then we have the rounds of improvements. Round 0 starts with communicating the overall constraints, such as customer demand, how much a facility could produce if it were running on all cylinders, or how many overall shift hours are available, provided that they are not allowed to increase. Round 1 identifies the next biggest constraint below the overall constraint and what is being done to alleviate it. Round 2 identifies the biggest constraint after the first one was addressed. Round 3 and 4 follow the same process as round 2, but for the next respective constraint. Columns may be added to include more rounds. Eventually, the cyclical reduction in bottlenecks results in a highly streamlined process with much smaller bottlenecks that are negligible. All right, so next I'm going to show you some examples of this tool being used by some fictitious organizations. So one, we have Gertrude's Garden, and she's working on a weed pool reduction project. So Gertrude is doing a project to reduce her weed pulling efforts. She only has 10 hours of labor available to dedicate to gardening activities each week. So she's using the theory of constraints in the King-Kopp matrix to optimize the use of her time. Ideally, she would like to spend most of her time harvesting so she can reap the rewards of her efforts. This matrix is being used in its own improvement project, but is associated with a group of lower level improvement projects that are being done in a certain order to support completion of this higher level project. This example shows the initial condition and the first 4 rounds of improvements. So in round 0, the initial condition at the beginning of this project is the whole 10 hours per week of available gardening time being used to pull weeds. Round 1, Gertrude completed a lower level improvement project to change from wooden raised beds with pea gravel aisles to mulch beds with concrete tile aisles to minimize weeding. This reduced the amount of time spent pulling weeds from 10 hours to 2 hours. As a result, she began spending 2 hours per week on watering, 1 on planting seeds, and 5 on transplanting seedlings to the garden with the 8 newly available hours. In round 2, in Gertrude's second lower level improvement project, she changed from annual vegetables to mostly perennial edibles and microgreens to minimize transplanting time. This reduced the amount of time spent transplanting from 5 hours to 1 hour. As a result, she began spending an extra hour per week planting perennial edibles and began harvesting 3 hours per week with the 4 newly available hours. In round 3, in the third lower level improvement project, Gertrude added rainwater collection and irrigation to minimize watering. This reduced the amount of time spent watering from 2 hours to 1 hour. As a result, she began spending an extra hour per week planting perennial edibles with the 1 newly available hour. In round 4, the fourth lower level improvement project was to plant perennial edibles until the garden was full, then stop planting perennial edibles and only plant microgreen seeds from that point forward. This reduced the amount of time spent planting seeds from 3 hours to 1 hour. As a result, she began spending 2 more hours per week harvesting with the 2 newly available hours. So the matrix shown stops after round 4 for the higher level King-Kopp matrix project because Gertrude is now spending more time on harvesting than on any other individual activities, which accomplishes the mission of the higher level project. Nonetheless, she will complete more rounds of lower level improvement projects to continue to optimize the use of her 10 hours of gardening time per week. Does anyone have any questions on that example or the matrix in general so far?
I don't see any questions in the in the chat box, Lucy. It doesn't mean that there's no questions. It just means that no one's typed any in.
Okay. I'll show you a few more examples.
Perfect.
I'm not going to go into as much detail. So Julie's General Store has a project to deal with the fact that the line is too long at the service counter. So Jade, the service counter manager, only has one service counter in the store because of the way the store was built. So she's using the theory of constraints in the King-Cobb matrix to optimize the use of the service counter and minimize the average number of people waiting in line during rush times. This example shows the initial condition and the first 5 rounds of improvement. So you can see the actions that she has taken. She added a second register and assigned Jasper to work at the service counter during mid-morning rush and lunch rush, and the line length was cut by 50%. They created a self-service counter to hold coffee, tea, and lemonade dispensers, and Jade will issue a cup to the customer upon payment, and that cut the line length by 15%. They also moved the refrigerator from behind the service counter out to the store area for self-service, and that cut the line length by 5%. They relocated napkins, utensils, sugar, creamer, salt, pepper, and condiments to the self-service counter near the beverage dispensers, and that also cut the line length by 5%. And lastly, they added a self-service screen in the store area and a section of the store website for placing catering quantity orders or other pre-orders. This includes a limited menu, predefined scaled up quantities, and a minimum of 48-hour notice restriction. And that cut the line length by 2%. Here's an example with Mary's Machine Shop. So she has an issue with a certain widget that is in very high demand, and they cannot keep up with the flow rate, the output rate that the customer would like. So Paul, the production manager, wants to improve slow widget output. So he's using the theory of constraints in the King-Cobb matrix to optimize the flow of widgets and minimize the overall widget lead time in the eyes of the customer. So this example shows the initial condition and the first 5 rounds of improvements. And this one is a slightly more complex example, but in this case, for round 1, they started using 2 mills at a time to make these widgets, and the widget lead time was cut down from 4 weeks to 2 weeks. In the second round, they reduced the batch size to 50 per work router, so they could do 50 widgets per mill and ship 100 widgets per week. And the widget lead time was cut down from 2 weeks to 1 week. In round 3, they set up cellular manufacturing in the finishing department, so 8 people are finishing the widgets at a time instead of 1. In round 4, they made 2 more fixtures so they could do offline setup for loading the widget into the fixture, then do quick changeover of the fixtures in the mill. And for round 5, they purchased special diamond coated end mills to be able to cut the hard material without difficulty. Any questions on those examples? All right, so I have a question for you guys, and the question is, what kinds of bottlenecks do you typically experience in your work or personal life that maybe could be addressed using the theory of constraints? Never enough time to get it all done.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this and really thinking about our constituency, folks who run membership associations. Typically they're doing it on a volunteer basis. They have a possibly unrelated, full-time job, full-time, gig elsewhere. And there's just so much to do to either put on events or create advocacy events or whatever it is that they gather around. And they gather infrequently. So I'm just thinking about this as a smarter, more detailed version of Stephen King's, take care of the big rocks first. The whole idea about putting this in a matrix and, identifying and dealing with the most significant constraints is completely applicable, I think, to running an organization when you have like super limited resources. It's like, what is the most important thing that I have to get done? Okay, if I do that, what does that allow me to do next? So on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That process thinking, I think, is very important to running membership associations. Certainly in terms of the routine or the productivity aspects of it.
Okay. Skip says supply lead and delivery times for manufacturing. Lots of variables and timing issues in your work and for delivery and execution. So what would you say are the biggest holdups? Do you have long lead time materials?
Yeah, it's interesting because we deal with lead times potentially in years for acquisition of materials. So with millions of individual parts and everything else, this would be a hard matrix to implement across something that large. I think it's something in our case, if we could define a specific area that we get down into, then there would be an opportunity to use a matrix of this type to try and determine if there's other internal or external factors that could be used or be mitigated. But that's one of the interesting things here is I keep saying this is, we talk about iterative processes and iterative development. And as you go from round 1 to round 2 to round 3, it's really that same process, whether you do it consciously as one whole, or whether you do it as I'm going to complete round 1, then I'm going to think about how we make improvements in round 2 into round 3. That's where I see a lot of value in here that could be used within businesses in an iterative process improvement.
Yeah, this is definitely intended to be specific. So I don't think that it should be used at a business level. It should be used at a project level. So that's a good comment that you've brought up. Tricia says not enough people to get work done. Conflicting demands. Meeting business needs, getting impacted by a need to meet escalating security requirements. All right.
Yeah, and actually, as a simpler example, if you go back to your restaurant that we were talking about a minute ago, I can just imagine if it was my restaurant, I would have put that second person on to do work, and they either wouldn't have done the job right or they would have quit. And I'd maybe had gotten into round 3 or 4, and I'd be back to round 1 again.
Yeah, so some of that is, for each round using the DMAIC cycle and putting controls in place to make sure that the changes stay in place and stay working long term. So maybe when you're putting a second person on, you have to make sure that they get trained as well as the first person to be able to do the job. As you said, otherwise they might quit or fail or something like that.
Can I ask one more thing, though? I'm going to piggyback off of what Tricia had, if you don't mind, Lucy. So Tricia brings up escalating security requirements, and we see this all the time in a lot of industries. They're what I call the unfunded mandates, right? Somebody issues a decree, you have to do X, regardless, whether you have capacity, time, availability, money, whatever. So how does the COP matrix actually allot for that? I've finished round 2. I've created an improvement. All of a sudden, there's an unfunded mandate that comes through. You have to do X, and it fundamentally changes a portion of what we thought the assumptions were within there. So how do you use the COP matrix to do those kinds of adjustments when these kinds of security changes or process rule changes are handed down from someone else and have a material functional impact on how you thought the work was supposed to flow?
I would say possibly you could add it as another constraint and work within considering the other constraints, and you'd have to adjust all the numbers, right? So to account for the new wrench being thrown in the machine.
Would you just continue through and the breakdown add those constraints, or is that something, I guess, if it's significant enough that you might actually consider just restarting over again, kind of from a round zero perspective?
That's a good point. It depends. It depends on the situation, whether you would just add it to the matrix or whether you would have to redo the matrix to, like, let's say it's the biggest constraint. Well, yeah, you might have to redo the matrix starting with that one, and maybe not lose your lessons learned from your previous activities, but that's the constraint you have to work within now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It may be your new overall constraint. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right. Well, I have one more question for you guys, and that is, what was the most useful thing that you learned about today as far as the theory of constraints and the King constraint optimization matrix?
Well, I can tell you, for me, the useful thing, I touched on this before, is really this methodical approach to prioritizing what's next. What should I tackle next? Granted, probably out in the real world, I don't know if there's a waiting phase, strictly following the DMAIC cycle or whatever, for each phase or each possible constraint. But I like the idea of at least understanding, say, here's the most important one. This is what I should deal with first. If I'm successful at this, this is what it's likely to yield for me to go ahead and do this. It's kind of like what Tricia was saying before. It's like, it kind of forces me thinking out the most likely beneficial process, as opposed, which may or may not be the same thing as what instinctually you want to say you want to tackle next. So I really like the structure for this. It's orderly and appeals to the engineer in me.
All right, well, great. Anyone else?
I'd like to add a little bit to that. I appreciate the structuring too. I have a personal impediment there because I see all the things that can be done and I want to do them all at once, and something needs to hold me back. And I think something like a tool like this would help hold me back. It would force me to write it down before you do it. Write down the order you're going to do it in, all those reasons why and what we're expecting out of it, and actually measure each step. And I do tend to do a lot of things at once, and then I make assumptions about what was the thing that was most impactful. And you don't come away with as many lessons learned if you're not methodical like this.
All right, well, great. Thank you. Anyone else? All right. Well, without further ado, I will turn it back to Mark to introduce our next speaker.
All right. So, yeah, thank you very much, Lucy. Appreciate it. Turn off my own share screen here. Hey, so yeah, very insightful. It's one of those things, like, what I always ask people when they attend these sessions at PDCHR, no matter who's presenting, I ask everybody to fill out a survey at the end, and one of the questions is about intentionality. Are you going to try this stuff? So this is what I encourage is, take that, whatever nuggets you take away from this, and what you take away from Skip, and what you take away from Cindy. Make sure you also set aside, time to plan about how you're actually going to try some of this stuff out. It may not be all of it, but take 3 golden nuggets and apply one, and something magic happens. That's actually pretty solid. So again, thank you so much, Lucy. What I'm going to do now is we'll turn this over to William, but I only know him as Skip Leezer. I think I'm just going to rename him there in the Zoom window. Skip's got a couple words, some insights to share about transformational leadership and agile and all those. It's like just chock full of buzzwords, but they're actually good ones. So, Skip, I turn it over to you, sir.
All right. Get that up, get that going, and are we in presentation? All right. So the interesting thing, I'll just say a couple of words about me. Again, you saw William up there. I go by Skip. That's my nickname. I've been using it pretty much since I was born. So if you address me as William or as Skip in here, up until I was about 30 years old, I would not have known who you were talking to if you said William. I think the older you get, the more comfortable you become with it. I'm an enterprise and technical architect at Newport News Shipbuilding. My discussion today is a little bit more dealing towards the practical side. So as we go in the conversations, I was very used to the environment background in business analysis, business systems, construction, technology development. So I was very used to building all of these charts, designs, developments, process diagrams, how we implement different business analysis changes and everything else. And what we're going to talk about today is NNS's move for IT moving into an agile environment and the impacts and the effects that created on us as part of the architecture team and development. So again, we'll talk a little bit about, I need to provide a little background and context, I think, on who Newport News Shipbuilding is. You need to understand this nature of it, a little bit of understanding of what enterprise architecture is, because my thinking is based around enterprise architecture at this point in technology. We'll talk about the agile journey for NNS, and then we're going to talk about some of those leadership areas that were used to build agile integration. And they're not charts and they're not diagrams, but they're efforts of all of these things that kind of build together. And we'll talk about that as how it had to be adapted and moved going forward. So if you're not familiar, who is Newport News Shipbuilding? Well, it's a division of Huntington Ingalls Industry, founded in 1886. So this is a very old company for shipbuilding. In a nutshell, this company produces the most complex military ships and designs in the world for anyone, primarily dealing with carriers and submarines. But as a company for HII, we have multiple divisions that actually do quite a bit more than that around here. The company's produced more than 800 ships since its inception. It's the sole builder of U.S. carriers and nuclear carriers in the United States, and only one of 2 builders of submarines and nuclear submarines in the United States. So a couple key things to take away as we start talking about, well, what goes into all of this, right? Carrier build, that big piece of machinery. When you step out there, if you've ever been on a football field, that's 100 yards roughly. Or if you want to go 100 meters from end zone to end zone, it's more than 3 times the length of that football field. 3+ football fields, end to end, end of end zone to end of end zone together, and longer for these new classes of ships. These things are absolutely immense and complex. We spent 4 to 5 years just planning the ship, going through designs and everything else, just trying to get to the engineering of it all. 5 to 7 years in building, and that's assuming that there's no issues or no major new technologies have been put into place that would cause additional delays. And then there's still another year or 2 for the actual further outfitting of it by the Navy before it really gets deployed out there. So if you notice today, there's actually a keel laying for the new aircraft carrier Enterprise, which is a replacement of the last aircraft carrier Enterprise, which was decommissioned in our yard in 2017, if I recall. So we have that keel laying taking place. And so to keep in mind, that has taken probably 5 to 6 years for us to get to the point that we're laying that metal down to create the keel, the infrastructure, that support structure for the ship. that gets built out. It takes a long time to build these things out. We're a large organization. You know, I want to illustrate that these are really complex feats of engineering and design. And when you get something to this size, architecture likes to deal with big picture strategic elements. But it's very hard as an organization to often get to that big picture. We have so many silos that operate within the organization that are really just looking at very small pieces. Sometimes it's really hard to understand how everything fits together at a high scale. I mentioned a little bit before about, you know, supply chain items. We've had supply items in here that just for the metal orders for the building of the ship, those could take anywhere from 3 to 5 years just from a planning, delivery, and actually could be delivered years in advance of when they're used on the ship. So the tracking and the management, the use of all of this is incredibly complex and time intensive. There's a huge propensity in here for duplication of work and duplication of efforts within the organization. All right. So what is architecture by definition? By definition, the goal of architecture is develop a view of the organization's strategy, information processes, and IT assets with the intent of connecting an organization's business mission, methodologies, and processes to its IT strategy. You know, this is a tough question. Everybody always asks, what is enterprise architecture? And there's this conversation of what is the elevator pitch that you're going to use for architecture. Architecture is nothing more than trying to look at the big picture of all of the IT elements that we deal with and finding ways to make them work together more smoothly without creating that duplication and redundancy that exists out there. It is an aspiration and a set of goals that are incredibly hard and complex to be able to execute and put into practice on a daily basis. So some of the issues and the reality that affect us is we have architects in our organization that clearly, just like every individual that's out there, each architect is a bit different in their knowledge. Some have specialties in data sciences, some have specialties in data management, others have specialties in the infrastructure components. My specialty is actually more from the process development, strategic planning orientation of things. So we have very wide, diverse skill sets in there, and sometimes that doesn't translate very clearly for everybody understanding the background processes and everything else. We have to realize that these are really complex systems. These are high-level discussions that we're trying to get to, but often we're very tactically focused as an organization. And what I mean by that is, I need to do X, and I need X to work now. But from an architecture perspective, I may want to be several layers above that. I may not want to introduce continuing changes into an application that we built if I know that 2 years down the road, we're planning to replace the COTS product or implement core code out of a COTS product that we already have. So why would I want to continue investing into those things? And that's part of architecture's responsibilities, to look for those opportunities where we can reduce that waste and reduce the repetition of work for something that will work better and be more core, as we say, more core code using the application and the COTS product rather than us having to do that customized development. Time pressures are obviously big issues also. We've got a lot of moving parts moving around, you know, thousands of different things every single day. And then sometimes it's very hard to get time to stop and actually look at how this works. The other problem we have is process development. So we utilize TOGAF, the Open Group Architecture Framework within NNS. And there are very succinct steps. So the COP model that was shown from before, that's not necessarily part of it, but there are these kinds of unique operational processes every time we make changes that we're supposed to follow. But the move to the agile environment created issues. So let's talk a little bit about what NNS put in place. So prior to this, our development or our delivery teams, most of them operated in one of two methodologies. They were either in Scrum, one form or another, and it was not necessarily standardized. Or we had a good number of teams that were also operating in Kanban. So going forward, the enterprise agility system, you'll hear me say EAS or EAS. The goal of that system was to stand up 5 primary portfolios, handling the different service areas and business capabilities for the organization, align those up, get everybody into a Scrum process, utilizing SAFe as a background for the work. Although we do have some smaller delivery teams that are still using Kanban out there. And the other issues that we've gotten into is that not all sprint cycles are unified. So what this meant from what this means from a development perspective is these portfolios are organized by portfolio teams, product teams, and delivery teams. And architecture now exists in the portfolio and the product teams. So from going from being very strategically oriented, hey, we need to build out the diagrams, we need to go through the assessments, perform the analysis. Agile forces us into a system that says, yes, we're going to do that, but in a very iterative manner. We're going to give you very high level specifics from an architecture and a problem perspective. And you know what, as they get down to the actual development of the work, that's where we'll start getting into more detail. Rather than defining and building detail up front and being able to show and illustrate how it's used from there. In my case, I'm started on one portfolio. I was actually the initial technical architect assigned to the very first portfolio in this journey. I am now the technical architect on the very last portfolio, helping to get them stood up. And we have lots of different areas. I mean, just our portfolio alone handles or accounts for work that goes out through more than 12,000 people within this company. One portfolio, 4 delivery teams, 2 product teams. So that's an awful lot of responsibility for work and to make sure that we get this right and can help them improve their business and make that journey better. So strategic issues from an architecture perspective. I assume there's some familiarity with Agile for everybody on this call. If that's not the case, please leave a note and I'll be happy to answer a little more. But in the past, architecture's kind of laid and lived outside of the actual execution processes of going out and building work. Kind of help build the diagrams, we build charts, we go through the matrix discussions, we provide recommendations, and then everybody has the opportunity to go out and live it. We're now embedded within this process. And it's a very fast-moving process, talking about days or weeks at most, trying to continue moving work forward. It's very different than the old, where we might have taken months just going through the requirements development, as well as matrix discussions, architecture discussions leading up to it. So it's very different. We can't always find the time to do the kind of planning that we used to do previously. Our planning is now much more iterative, on the go, on the fly. We've had issues certainly trying to figure out exactly how we fit some of these architectural discussions, documents, and processes in place to fit within the Agile journey and ease that we have now. Where we exist now often is that we'll make a lot of recommendations and guidelines as we go through this development process and building out solutions and going through, but these are guidelines. We still don't have proper oversight and everything. There's a very big difference between a guideline and a standard that architecture has the ability to issue. So a guideline, I'll bring up that instance where I said we have an application that's custom developed, and if we're going to replace it, why would I continue developing it? Well, my ability right now is that I can issue a guideline that says we should no longer do any development in the old system. A standard would be better, because a standard would say that we will no longer perform development in any system that has the potential of being replaced, let's say, in the next 18 months. My guideline simply says you should do that. The standard says you will do that. It becomes more of a corporate company policy to be followed. And those are things that are missing in our current journey. And quite frankly, we still have to do a better way of finding out how to implement that. And of course, the idea that architecture solutions can be very complex. Look, these Agile systems are very much set up to focus on tactical issues. I need a new report. I need this done. I need an improvement in the process over here. But architecture, while it can have a hand in that, generally wants to look at the overall process, the overall work, and the overall infrastructure of a solution. all right, I want to look down the road and say you have a need for a change in your capability matrix. What changes in infrastructure do I have to provide to make sure that we can get there, and how do we get those planned out? Those are complex things, and often right now within our ease journey, our ease journey is saying, you're going to do X, you're going to do Y, you're going to do Z, and you're not going to look at those, you're going to do each one of them individually. So there's still the ability and the need to find ways to step back within there. And those are a number of the issues. I mentioned before about complexity. So oddly enough, and I made this so you couldn't really read it, the illustration of the diagram is almost more important. So we've defined out roughly 10 services within the overall organization. This is a piece of work that I've been pushing and working on for about 6 months within the organization. Really from the business side to get them to start defining out exactly more of what they do from a business service development capability into the business functions and the different work assignments or work areas that they need to perform underneath it. The intent of this is really to tie them back to the capabilities of the organization. And more specifically, as we develop IT work within the portfolios, we can now align that back up to the business functions over here and say, yes, we're actually achieving something in that mission. You know, it's kind of like a roadmap on steroids. What I want to present here is we're about halfway done with this one piece. And this is one of 10 within the organization for development and go out. And these are very high level business functional sections within the company. So I wanted this to understand that when we start talking about architecture, I'm really talking about very complex, difficult ideas and just trying to get the business to even understand how all of their parts relate. As I said, in many cases, this has been a multi-month journey just to get the business to understand their own work. Another example of this is actually talking about how we do some of the submarine item in terms of program interaction, and you can just see that the complexity of the discussion here, well, the diagram is not overly complex. When you start breaking down the different pieces, you know, where our agile portfolios exist within here, we would take one small little sliver of all of this. We would actually break that down probably quite a bit further. And from that perspective, that's how we get into agile with a specific piece of work. So again, these are not simple things. We started the portfolios off 3 months of training. As I mentioned before, there's a portfolio team. Essentially, they're given the oversight of all the work within a given portfolio. In my case right now, supply chain and waterfront. That deals with supply chain issues, warehousing, material management, logistics, facilities, actual execution of work assignments from welding and inspections and the nuclear propulsion work that we have. There's a lot of different things that go into it. Our product teams are the ones that as we build out these problem statements through the epics, we assign that down to the product teams, and it's their responsibility to start working on, as we've assigned a problem, what are the potential solutions that they could use for that. My goal as a technical architect is I'm trying to provide guidance, again, the guidelines, not the standards, to them on how to do that. And then the delivery teams figure out the actual execution of, well, how do we actually make that work? And the key to this is there are 3 teams or 3 sets of teams. But if these teams are all operating independently, we're not going to be productive in getting the work done. It has to be that communicative, cooperative approach. Portfolio works with product, portfolio works with delivery, product works with delivery, and vice versa. So we work up that way up and down the stack. One of the key takeaways in all of this is that we're all used to doing things a certain way. Our delivery teams have been heavily impacted by this. They've been able to control the flow of their own work, and this process brought in 2 additional teams above them that are managing and trying to do that, and it's been very uncomfortable. The same could be said for architecture. It has been very uncomfortable because we're used to doing things from a high-level strategic perspective, and now we're trying to get in this tactical. So sometimes it's difficult to work, you know, what I term as true architecture. You know, I'd like to take things like the comp matrix and put it into place. But the moment I try to break out a document like that and we try and go through an iterative process there, the answer would be, this is taking too long, you need to get into doing the work faster. So there has to be a way that we integrate this work, and it has to be a change of thinking within architecture itself, that we can execute some pieces of this work while still executing the tactical. But we have to remember, I mentioned before about the idea of the COP matrix being something that would be iterative. Well, to me, each one of those iterations is a different epic or a different piece of work. And as long as I approach it that way, I can still build on documents that were there from before. And I can iterate that process through the epic development and the way that we push our work through in the agile structure to make that happen. Our real goal out of all of this was, how do we improve our throughput rate? How do we get work done faster? How do we show more value for the work being performed? And how we've actually illustrated that. And we have a number of different ways. So, you know, where we are in this journey at this point, I mentioned all the portfolios are stood up. Architecture really has shifted from that strategic approach to a much more tactical advice, guidance, and deliveries. We still struggle with the strategic side, but we're beginning more things such as business road mapping and IT road mapping, integrating in there so that there is, from a guideline perspective, kind of a map that we can all kind of align to. I mentioned that before. So the guidelines, the recommendations for the SAs, which are the solution architects, and the SEs, the solution engineers or system engineers, that actually really build a lot of the real specific items in IT for the solution development. I still think we need a guidance board or a governance board. The idea of getting to standards so that we can make, you know, more practices or more policies. We've definitely improved our ability getting into metrics and KPI driven elements so that we can actually begin seeing. Like I said, our goal was, how do we turn around and how do we plan for work? How do we break it into smaller segments, and how do we get the capacity of the teams aligned up correctly? And I think we've done a good job with that within the overall ease agile journey. Although each of the delivery teams are probably still somewhat frustrated by it and having it driven. But the goal is really to make it so that we're not over committing to a lot of work. You can make all the promises you want, but as anybody else in here knows, if you're trying to do 10 things at once, you're going to have a hard time getting more than one of them done if you're lucky, or you will be so distracted trying to get them all done, you'll never get any of them done right. And we're still working to improve that value discussion, the process of how we define value, improve the delivery of value. Look, that's a hard one. I've worked in a lot of companies over the years, and value is always the endpoint that we want to get to. What value do we deliver? If we said we were going to save 5,000 man hours of work over a given year, did we actually do that? And I think what usually happens in most companies like NNS and many others that are not incredibly disciplined in their metrics is, there's an understanding and a knowledge that it'll save time, but there's a real difficulty in trying to quantify qualitative values and qualitative work items in a process. So, you know, we'll continue to keep improving on that journey, and I know most everyone else will also. All right. So what do we actually get out of this? And we went through, what were the changes for architecture? What were the improvements? What were some of the insights? You know, I'll say this real quick about our journey. Architecture has had a hard time implementing a lot of the changes because, again, we operate at that strategic level. In fact, we have issues when we start talking about these projects, like SAP is one of our major systems in there, and it affects every single portfolio. So who's going to organize, manage, and oversee that work when we all operate in our own individual portfolios, almost within silos to some degree? Architecture plays a lead role in helping to define and organize the way that work is seen, its capability to be organized. So again, our part in here, whether we're talking about our portfolio, whether we're talking about all the portfolios, communicate often, repeatedly. I went through this path starting off as the first architect in the first portfolio. I held weekly and biweekly meetings with architecture and, in fact, lots of members of IT just trying to explain what was happening, going through that process. So eventually when they came up to it, they would be a little bit better prepared for it. Within our stack, that's what we call going from the portfolio down to delivery teams. Nobody operates in a vacuum. You know, this is cooperative work that all have to be aligned up and working together on, or we're not going to be effective in being able to do that. Recognize that not everyone follows the same path or journey. Not everybody will arrive to the end state at the same time. So what do I mean by that? A couple things. First of all, not everybody buys into the process at the same rate that you might. You might be highly in favor of it, or you might be more accepting or adaptive to change. Others are not. And you have to expect that, and you have to accept it. And you need to spend time understanding what makes their journey different than yours from a leadership perspective. In my case, on the portfolio side, it's my job to line up and get the solution architects and delivery leads to understand why we do this, to understand the benefits to IT and how it can actually be beneficial. And if I don't perform these things, if I don't understand what the impacts and the issues are to them, we're never going to be in sync, and we'll always have a problem trying to understand that. I have to understand their journey as much as I have to understand the work that we're trying to achieve. Being humble. Look, you'll never understand everything in here. It's a recognized fact when we put these portfolios together, and as we started moving through this journey, that a lot of the architects and a lot of the folks in the portfolio side especially had not worked in those service areas for the business. So quite frankly, a lot of people on the delivery side had all of the knowledge and had most of the business communication. And quite frankly, they've had to train us. You know, we kind of have the management, the perspective. I understand how architecture should be implemented, but I've had to get a lot of training from everybody else. Listen intently and often. Listening seems like such a simple thing, but the reality is that a lot of people listen with the intent of responding. Don't. Listen intently. Listen to what people have to say. Try and understand the meaning, the intent of what they're saying, not just the actual execution of words that they're saying. And do this often. It's more important to listen more than it is to speak. Be there for others. So this is whether they need help with questions in the process. Maybe they need some additional training. As I said, my job as a technical architect or the lead architect within the portfolio is not just to make sure I get my work done. It's to make sure that those underneath me, those that are actually taking what I provide to them, understand it, and more importantly, understand why. And if I'm wrong, make sure they correct me and to make sure we get it right. And that's part of that cooperative communication that exists between us. Take on responsibilities when others won't. This is a rough one because you have to protect yourself to some degree. You can't take on so many things that you can never get everything done. I said that was a cardinal principle. If you're trying to do too many things, you can never get any of them done well. However, there are exceptions to this. I showed before kind of the business service roadmap that I was beginning to build out with the organization. That was not a responsibility of my portfolio. That was a need, a gap that needed to be filled to allow us for development work for a piece of work that we're doing called PEO, to be able to implement it properly moving forward in the agile environment. And that has meant months of extra work on my part and others who I've recruited in to assist with doing that. But it's the right thing to do. Sometimes there are pieces of work. And again, this is one that from an architecture perspective, strategic perspective, had to be completed for us to really line up work in the portfolios to make this happen. And somebody had to step up and do it. And it just happened to be me for this one. For other pieces of work, there'll be other architects or other technicians, engineers, and others that'll pick it up and run with it. In this case, it happened to be mine. But there'll be a lot of opportunities where people don't want that responsibility. You know, leadership within the organization, leadership within our portfolio within here necessitated somebody pick it up and run with it. And in this case, I was the one to do it. Do what's right, not what's easy. Common statement, common phrase. However, there are lots of people every single day that are yelling at the portfolio. my work needs to be prioritized, my work needs to be prioritized. And we use valuation scores, and we use what are called WSJF scoring for weighted shortest job first to put these forward. And a lot of people disagree with those. So our job is still to align the work up based upon what we believe in the portfolio and what the scoring and the valuation is telling us is the most important thing, not the thing that's most expeditious because somebody's screaming in someone else's ear. And that includes if we have directors that come down and ask us to stand up to them and make sure that we are still trying to align that work. We won't win every battle, but it's not an easy thing to do, but it's the responsibility that we have. Act with aggression. I love this phrase, but maybe it doesn't mean what most people think. I think in a lot of cases, we get to the issue of analysis paralysis. We start to get to the issue of there's so many people invited into the conversations that we just keep doing planning after planning after planning after planning. At some point in leadership within an organization, or in this case within the portfolio, you have to stand up and say, look, we're done planning. This is the solution that we're going to take. Sometimes it'll fully agree with the business and sometimes not. Sometimes we get agreement between. But once you've made that decision to go, no more thinking about the planning. Go. Again, recognize that this is agile and we're going to iterate the work. So again, going back to that COP set, I'm going to implement round one, round two, round three. And I'm going to do it step by step by step. But we're not going to go back and keep rethinking about it. We may review after we've done an implementation. Say, did we get the improvement we expected? If we didn't get the improvement we expected, we may modify what goes into round 2 or round 3 or round 4. But we're going to act and we're going to do it aggressively. We're going to try and push work forward and we're going to try and get it done as fast as we can so that we can move on to the next piece. And it might be an iterative piece of the work that we just did, or it might be a new piece of work that we have to get to also. 5th principles. Cannot say this even better. Keep it simple. I don't need to explain the last letter, I think. Keep it simple. It is so easy to come up with complex solutions. We do this every day. You know, when you sit there and you think about it, simplest solution is almost always the best approach. There are too many people that go through in life and in leadership here within the portfolio. It's our job to continue to remind everybody that iterative approaches are still the best. So you don't have to solve every problem as we go through these epics in this development. We need to solve the current problem, and then we can work on iterative improvements to that problem. You know, we've had instances in here where they wanted a complex cloud solution developed, would have taken us many months. Turned out, you know, as I looked at it, and the solution was, hey, there's an application we can install. You can get right to using these systems without having to wait months for something else to go. Oh, and by the way, it probably cost us about $5,000 instead of $50,000 or $60,000 for that solution. So, yeah, not everything has to be overly complicated. And lastly, unify. Look, people in the process are everything. You know, we always talk about automation of structure, automation of systems, analyzing and everything, but more often than not, it's people that make or break everything within the system. So how you treat, how you manage, how you lead them through example and through conversation and empathy and everything else you can think of in there plays a huge part into the success, in our case, of the agile portfolios that we have in place. All right, so again, that was not so much a discussion about specific matrix options or anything else you might use, but really talking iterative and you know, hopefully giving a bit of a real life example on how architecture and complex issues are broken down into our agile journey. But any questions?
Yes, Skip, check out that question from Tricia. Unless Tricia, you want to just, you know, go on mic and expand a little bit.
Oh yeah, so I was just thinking about actually where my thoughts started, and I didn't put this in here, is at the beginning of the talk, we're talking about how complex the overall system is. And I'm saying system, but I'm meaning a ship, a sub, whatever. It's big, it's humongous.
Yeah.
And something we do in one process may have an impact elsewhere. So in the past, almost everything I've ever worked on, somebody has been able to keep the whole big picture in their head. Well, things are kind of big for that when we're talking chips and subs. And if one person did have all that in their head and they died, you know, we'd be out of luck. So I'm not really sure how that gets managed, but that led me to think that in general, sometimes you get into a situation where you need to prepare for what happens if we lose all the critical people who know all the stuff that's important.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the context of this diagram, talking about service breakdowns and how we'll align the business capabilities back up, I think from a strategic perspective, and this is whether we're talking architecture or real strategic management planning or anything else, we have to understand that everything begins and ends with the business. And it's very easy sometimes within IT to forget that. Sometimes it's easy to think that I am leading the charge, I am leading the change, but IT should never lead the change. IT should always be either a reaction to something existing on the business sphere or the business process that they're trying to develop, the capabilities they need to use, or the planned capabilities that they're going to need to use going out. So in other words, when we start talking about the next round of carriers for development, if there's new technologies that need to be implemented as part of that, IT has a responsibility on its own roadmap and our strategic architectural planning years in advance to start planning for that work. And in fact, there are some very large elements that'll have downstream effects on the business for it. But that's what this is really designed to do. Tricia, again, I mentioned that there are 10 service areas that we've identified. This is being led from the business perspective to make sure that the business understands itself. Can it define what the building blocks are of that service? In this case, I've pulled up what is planning, right? Can it define its own building blocks? If I just said, what makes up planning? Those are what the building blocks are. And then the business functions are the deliverables. What are the specific items within those given blocks of work that need to be developed? And then we continue to break that down further. So does that mean that this documents all the processes related to the business? Absolutely not. What it does mean is that all of those processes should align back up to business functionality or even multiple sets of business functionality in here. Does this mean that IT aligns to all of it? Yeah, absolutely. IT, everything. We started this with the perspective of PEO, which is just another way to manufacture and how we do our ordering, our material orders, and everything else within the system. I don't want to explain further than that. But the goal of that is that we can actually align all of that back up. That we can tie out what the relationships are with the dependencies. Is this going to replace the human capital, the knowledge in somebody's head? Not entirely. Will it help to draw the correlations so that the next round of individuals coming along could plan and manage and understand and learn? Absolutely. Is this bigger than PEO? Which, by the way, is this small of a piece of work for all of this going out? Yeah, it's much bigger than that. There's an opportunity to expand that to kind of all program service areas that could be used and correlated back to, because these services make up the company. But it's led through the business development of that.
Company. I think my concern is we've got a picture here that some people have come together and made this picture that represents something. I don't know that it's in anybody's head, so who's using this? Are they using it? What value is this piece of paper?
Yeah, that's a fair point. And so who's using it and are they using it? Are they using it yet? No. Who's using it? The leaders within these business areas are definitely bought into this. And our next steps are actually bringing the IT services area in for the development work to align it back up to it.
That's my second part of it. We keep talking IT, and yet when I think ships, I think engineers, and they're the people who think they are driving everything, aren't they?
The engineers drive the solutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, the engineers drive the solutions, absolutely. But in terms of aligning the work, that is what the portfolio and the product teams are supposed to be able to try and do. But again, not without cooperation of engineers. And we pulled some in, but that's kind of my handoff from this diagram back over to what we've called the Tiger team over on the portfolio side. And that'll be led by another team of probably 20 or 30 people. Much larger than the group that I've used for this one. We may have 20 people involved, but we've kind of kept different areas apart because it's really easy, again, at that point to have so many people making comments on it that it's really difficult to get agreement.
Do you feel like you can step back from this and look at it and say, okay, we have got a few key people in this process keeping this all working right now, and if we lose those people, this is not going to move forward anymore?
I think as we go along and continue developing it out, there should be the capability to do that for the business to identify for themselves, or even for IT to identify. We certainly have key individuals. Look, I'll just say from our perspective, we lost an engineer delivery lead this past week, which was key to our welding program over on supply chain and waterfront. Without that individual, who was really guiding and shepherding all of the IT related work for developing out the welding programs with the business, we're going to spend months just trying to get back to the outline of the work that this person had known, and probably years for the company to recuperate some of that knowledge with other individuals that'll now have to step up and spend a lot of time trying to learn. So yeah, single points of failure in any organization are not good. But I hope what this creates is more visibility, more capability to understand the correlations between work, the relationships, and those dependencies going forward. But this is a very strategic, high-level kind of document, much more architecture focused than what a lot of the stuff is that we do specifically within the portfolios themselves. So.
Thanks for sharing it. It's very, very impressive.
And I will say, Tricia, for you and everything, I lose sleep at night over this stuff because I think about the complexity of these things and just trying to get it organized. But, we talk about things in a 50, 30, 20, 10, 5, and so forth in terms of views of everything. And most of our people are focused really at ground level, and they understand their work at ground level. So, these kinds of organizational documents and how we do this and getting these teams together and keeping them together are really critical to long-term success at NNS. Our portfolios are not defined in these, but our portfolios all have work into here. And that's why it's critical that there still be an overarching design and structure to the work that we do.
Yeah, Skip. I'm thinking about this. Really in terms of how does this, what have we heard here today? How does this scale to assist membership organizations? And a couple things that you said, and actually one of the comments that Tricia put in the excuse me, in the chat box, kind of pull this together. So you'd mentioned about using all this, Skip, for both, is it, on the deck plates, is it, operational, tactical, or strategic, and stuff like that. And then, Tricia's question about, well, what happens when the organization changes? So in the membership organizations that PDCHR serves, I haven't run into a club or an association or group yet that's, hobbyists building carriers and submarines. So not necessarily facing.
Now there's model builders out there, Mark.
Yeah, and
those are still pretty complex models.
If I could get them onto our mailing list, anyways. But generally, the work of being an organization is not as complex. Doesn't take 50 years, 5 years, 10 years, lead time, stuff like that. But to Tricia's point, that body of knowledge, and I'm not sure if if Cindy is going to head towards this one, in her presentation. But that, the brain trust is in constant rotation, and it's a smaller group. There's 3, 4, 8 people or whatever running an organization, and by design, they are probably changing their jobs in the organization, and maybe just disappearing after about 2 years, right? Even if they go on to different roles, within like 6 or so years, the organization's leadership is completely turned over. Yet the essential strategy and business process of what they do has not changed. So there is this constant relearning. So I look towards enterprise architecture, probably small e, small a. Say, what exhibits, which of these models are appropriate for holding the information needed to operate tactically and to plan strategically. What is our rolling 5-year vision, stuff like that? How do we capture that?
Yep.
How do we?
Yeah, those are the roadmaps.
Right.
So that would not be the document that you saw that I had up before.
No.
Those would be the roadmaps that we actually developed for the portfolios. However, those roadmaps can absolutely tie up to that service document that's built up there to understand the execution points of how we're going to execute this large scale set of services across the organization. But yeah, when we talk about this strictly from a leadership standpoint, it's who has the vision and who has the capability to put those things together. We get so locked up in tactical discussions sometimes that we forget to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. And sometimes the bigger picture is just show me a little bit more, and sometimes depending on who you are, show me the overall picture of things. And Tricia had another really good point. So the engineers are down at our delivery side in our delivery teams, and she asked the question, well, how many engineers are on the board working together to start planning out the work that integrates into there? And the answer is, I know at least a couple. But the reality is just as I've said, and communicate often and communicate repeatedly, it doesn't work if we don't communicate up and down that entire stack. And whether you're talking about the company or whether you're talking about, a set of portfolio teams or even within your own team, communication is critical to everything. It's the number one thing you can do to improve everything within the company is make sure that you communicate, that you understand, and that everybody's documenting as many things as possible so that there's reference for this work. And in fact, one of the changes that we made was building reference libraries for our architecture work so that as architecture changes, we've had pretty good movement of people in and out of architecture in the last couple of years. We at least have documentation that can be used for that and links back to our stories and to the architecture, the diagrams that are used, and we can show the correlation between all of this work. It's not going to replace the knowledge in a person's head. Nothing replaces that unless you've got true AI capability to replace the person, in which case then we don't need people. But it's the closest thing to helping to understand not just that we have information, but the reasons why we do it. Because that's the true level of getting to knowledge, right? And wisdom. It's not just that I can find information about how to do something, but can I understand why we did it that way? Why are we continuing to do it that way? And so there are lots of ways to make improvements there. But these are big issues. You kind of have to work on it one step at a time.
Before we shift over to Cindy, I see Leonid put a question in the chat box. It's kind of a loaded question. How do you prepare and manage difficult situations such as COVID-19, et cetera? I'm guessing that there's not an abbreviated answer to that, and certainly none that would let Cindy have her fair share of time. But I was wondering if you got some really quick thoughts, or maybe you can offer a resource to share on that.
Yeah, so probably not so much from an architecture standpoint, but so within IT itself, there has been for years, and actually the major impetus for a lot of redesign for IT backups and infrastructure improvements have actually been since the World Trade Center attacks in New York. So it really led to businesses rethinking their backup and their structures for how they support and manage not just the data, the information, and the people within systems. There had always been talk in IT planning about pandemic planning, although I'm not sure that remote work was ever, certainly 10 years ago, even remote work was still something that was maybe a dream for a lot of people, not a reality. One-offs were the exception. But so that kind of planning, it really exists as IT planning and should be part of strategic planning. Does it happen with the regularity that it should? Some parts do, some parts, like when you start talking about scenario planning for different things. So I guarantee you that some IT teams probably have a zombie plan out there for a zombie apocalypse. Why? Maybe it's just a fun exercise, but those are, even if you do those kinds of plans, you get insights from them so that when COVID hit and the pandemic happened, yes, there were massive shifts to try and keep people out of the offices. Those are probably not things that businesses didn't consider, but that they have the plans fully in place. Do they have, we had talked when I was with the city of Virginia Beach years ago, and our backup plan was, my intent had been to secure contracts with companies in advance and have them on the shelf so that if something happened from a natural disaster standpoint, we could shift our employees to another city, another state where we had space available and we had computers and servers and everything on contract that we'd be able to get in within a very short period of time, so that we'd be able to keep up certain daily operations. That was one of my responsibilities for building that out. So it does happen. It's not so much an architecture thing. Architecture, we get involved in how do we make the infrastructure and everything still work together for those pieces. But I think that's there. The supply chain side, I'll just bluntly honest, I don't think anybody ever saw anything happening in that scale. And looking back on it, we probably should have. We should have seen the chip issues. There should have been more talk about consolidation of this work. It wasn't even just the issue of employees on the docks. It's the issue of employees in China and employees in Singapore and Taiwan and their availability to continue producing the chips and everything else that run our world today. I don't think anybody ever looked at it or had quite the insight on the global scale or what the global pandemic would actually do to our supply chain side. And years out now, we still deal with problems with that N&S. We have contracts with suppliers that, quite frankly, a lot of them went out of business during COVID. And we've struggled and had to fight to find ways to get them back in again. A lot of our costs, a lot of our overruns, and our scheduling issues are directly tied to our supply chain issues, both internally and with the vendors that we deal with. So, going forward, that invites another question of how do we diversify enough that we can limit the impacts, because you'll never get rid of it, but certainly we'll work on ways to try and limit potential impacts down the road again.
All right, super. All right, thank you so much, Skipper. Really appreciate that. The insight, and of course, getting called up to dance in the moment with the hard questions. So again, thank you so much for what you shared. What I'd like to do now is turn this over to Dr. Cindy Young, expert in knowledge management, and I am absolutely fascinated to learn about today's topic, focusing on the 8 wastes. So Cindy, it's all yours. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mark. And Trisha, I'd be happy to talk to you more about knowledge management as far as your questions you had for Skip, because that's a lot of what I do.
Great, because that's my biggest goal in life, is to have everything in my head, and it won't fit.
No, it won't. And I always use the expression, what happens if you get hit by a bus? Because it's so important that people talk to each other, and communication and knowledge planning are 2 of the big things that people think about as secondary. So, it supports everything. It has a part of the culture of the organization. So we're gonna talk a little bit about in here, and I'm gonna refer to a couple things like the act with aggression that Skip brought up. I've never heard that phrase, but I'm going to talk about waiting and analysis paralysis and all that stuff, fun stuff. But I have less than a half hour now, but I'm going to go through this and I'm going to share my screen and bring up the presentation. Okay. And I want to thank everybody for sticking around this long. I know it's Saturday, but hey, it's a great time to nerd out and have a good time. And I'm going to talk about knowledge management and the eighth waste. And so this is me on a slide. And so you'll get this presentation from Mark following the end of the event. And you can go and click these links and find out more. And if there's anything that you want me to talk about afterwards, feel free to hit me up. My email address is on the last slide. So started.
So Cindy, if you think you're already sharing, you're not.
I'm not. Oh, stuck. Sorry. Okay, so let's try again. Let's try one more time. Okay, your screen. This I'm screen sharing, so let's try it again. Am I screen sharing now?
There you go. You got it.
Oh, great. Hey, I was a service work officer, and it's all about project management and sharing slides and stuff. And so you think I'd be good at this? So okay. All right. So, like I said, this is me on a slide, and so you can click on any of these, and you'll see my background. I am a full-time defense contractor for Leidos. On the side, I have my company, CGN Consulting, and I'm all about knowledge management consulting and how to make it better for organizations to use their knowledge, to grow it, to find it, all this good fun stuff with the explicit and tacit knowledge or knowledge that's written down or that's based through experience. Okay, so our objectives, we have 3 objectives here. First, I'm going to define knowledge management for you. Second, we're going to talk about the 8 wastes. And then third, we're going to talk about how to combat the 8 wastes using knowledge management. All right, so what is knowledge management? And I'll tell you, this is my definition of knowledge management because there are over 100 definitions of it. There's no one dictionary you can go and find what the definition of knowledge management is. And so my definition is to know what to do with the information you have. And it's kind of like what Skip was just talking about. You have a bunch of information there, but if you don't know what to do with it, it's not going to do anybody any good. And that's what managing knowledge is. And so a lot of times you'll have somebody in each section or each silo. We want to eliminate those silos to eliminate waste as well as to communicate across the different departments or divisions or codes. And I'll tell you, I was on a ship, I was on destroyers most of my life, and you have to have knowledge management practices in place. You don't have to call them knowledge management like anything else. If you call something people will think is a fad and they won't want to listen to you. So if you talk to each other and you have daily communication or you have a plan to talk about what's going on, that's knowledge management. And so it's very easy to look at it and say, well, that's a fad, that'll go away, that'll go away like TQM did. Well, guess what? All these practices are still in play. Just I don't care what you call them. Just communicate to people. And the 8 wastes of downtime. So downtime's a really easy acronym to remember. The 8 wastes. And so we have these 8 wastes: defects, overproduction, waiting, non-utilized talent, and non-utilized talent is one of those big ones that HR works with. Sorry, I got cats running around here. Transportation, inventory, motion, and extra processing. So we're going to talk about those and then what you can do with knowledge management to eliminate those. Okay, so first is defects. And these are product or process imperfections. It can be in a manufacturing industry or a service industry. You may do development for professional support services, and you want to look at how to reduce the amount of times you have to do rework. Well, with knowledge management, you need to look at, first of all, who else in the organization can help you? Who may know the answer to what's troubling you? Um, have they solved it elsewhere? Is it documented? I gotta get a cat down. So is it documented anywhere? It may be documented in a process that maybe you're not familiar with. So you need to look at what you can do to reduce all these problems but it may be as close to the person working next to you in another room that they know how to fix this. So by sharing what they know, you can reduce defects before you even get started. But just know you can recover quickly too. Just don't be shy about asking, because there's no shame in asking, how did you fix this? In fact, it's better because you bring people together for a common cause. Okay. So overproduction. Well, we talk about overproducing and what are we going to do with things. And Skip talked about it a little bit earlier, how they produce products and they may sit in a warehouse. So this is sort of along the same lines. You overproduce, but if you don't put them into use, you're going to have storage problem. And so you may have too many things going on. Same thing goes with drafts. If you're constantly reviewing a process and you're rewriting it, you have too many revisions. People are not going to know which revision is the latest one unless you have a knowledge management policy in place of how you're going to name your naming conventions for your paperwork or for your your whole process in general. So one way you can use knowledge management is you can just share what you know between the project managers. So when you're working different projects, project managers, they have different things they're doing and they may have different tricks and tips that you can use. So good way to do it is to get people together. You can do it via lesson learned or a lunch and learn, or just get people to talk. Don't rely on the portfolio manager to keep track of anything for you because they're looking at dollars and cents and schedules. They're not looking at, okay, what was the problem that this person had in logistics? They are looking at, okay, how many people do I have working here? Do I have enough people that I can potentially use in this other project? And how can we save money doing this? Or how can we get more money paid to us? So overproduction is a big problem, especially when people you think about on ships. If any of you are on ships or work people on ships, you'll know that there's a lot of things kept on board. And it's just it's a mess sometimes. You go look for a part and you have multiple parts and you don't know which one's the right one or why you have it or when does it expire. So, gotta look at knowledge management and use that to reduce what you have and only keep what you have. And that kind of gets into the just in case versus just in time. So a lot of stuff going on here, but just be ready to look at your processes and streamline them. Talk to other project managers, make it work better for you. Okay, waiting. Waiting is I've written a lot about waiting. In fact, the latest thing I've written was in the Lean Mag, and I quoted Lily Tomlin because she in 1975 she was one of the people that was a host on Saturday Night Live. And Saturday Night Live, she's a comedian, so she's going to be talking funny. She says, hopefully I can quote it correctly. She stated that, why do you feel better when you're last in line and somebody gets behind you? Something like that. But it's true. You always feel better, when you're waiting in line and people are waiting behind you. So waiting is not necessarily a fun game for a business. You have a lot of people that make decisions, but if you're waiting to make a decision because you have to have every single thing in place, you're going to have that analysis paralysis or the inability to make a decision. And so you have delays in parts, the travel, the payments. So paying people, that's a hard thing. But don't delay in doing it because if you delay in doing it, you're not going to have those people there very long. So what can you do with waiting that's going to help through knowledge management? And so very simple. You have pre-planned responses, pre-briefs, use decision trees. You can have a process map. You can have a flow chart. What things are you going to have in place that's going to help somebody to make a decision? Because if you're waiting for them to make a decision and they have no idea what they're looking at, they're going to have to talk to a lot of people, or they're going to sit there and stew in their own misery of not knowing what to do. So when you have pre-planned responses, those PPRs make it very easy. They know where they are, and they can say, okay, I can go here, and this is what it says to do, and they just do it. Yes, and Mark says decision made when we're out of time or money. Yes, and you don't want to get to that point where you're doing decisions poorly. So you need to make a decision, but talk to other people, but also find out what's going on. and what's been done before. All right. And so non-utilized talent. We've all had this. We've all gone to organization and people don't know what we know, and we don't know what other people know. So if you're leading a team or own, own a company and you have to have something going on, well, rather than hire and spend all that money onboarding somebody new and possibly throwing off your culture of who you have in the organization, if you're not ready to grow, if you're not ready to pay for somebody fully, yeah, you can hire somebody part time, but you may not know what they know, and they don't know what anyone else knows. So there's things you can do for non-utilized talent to make sure that you know what people know. And one of the things that you can do is you can find out what the knowledge, skills, and abilities are. This is something you can do through HR, and you can have a program set up where you're building these knowledge, skills, and abilities. You have people tell you what they can do, and it's a good way to do it, but you still have to have a way to search for it. So while I concentrate on human centric knowledge management and having people talk to each other, you do have to use some technology here. And you may want to use something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. And you may put the systems out there and just have people tell you what systems they've worked on or what programs they've worked. Or if you're doing business development, hey, who's worked with this customer before? And I have a, Jeffrey Liker is, he helped me with an article I was writing and giving me a quote for non-utilized talent because non-utilized talent was not originally one of the 8 ways, 7 ways plus non-utilized talent. And he added it into his book, The Toyota Way. And what he told me is that one of the big things you can do is not necessarily just KSAs on their own, but you can get to know your people. It's as simple as talking to your people every day, and you'll find out that maybe they're too shy to brag about themselves, or that they don't know what you don't know. And if you rely on somebody's resume to tell you what they know, you're probably mistaken because most resumes are written tailored to the job and they're not all inclusive what that person can do. Somebody may have a skill they don't even realize is a skill. So understanding what their non-utilized talent is in your organization, it can help you to help other things and reduce the waste of having to hire somebody new, of having to take longer to train new people to do something somebody else already knows how to do. Now you're going to want to have other people learn how to do what this person does, but guess what? You're not going to have to spend a lot of money right then. You can look at how you're going to maintain that person, build that in your strategic plan, and look at waste reduction through that eye of your people because people know how to do things. You'll be surprised at what they can do. Okay, transportation. All right, transportation is lack of movement of not just vehicular transportation, but people, and communication. So I was writing communication because I want to forget about that. When you're sending, if you have to send a message through a chop chain. So, when I was in the military, I had to route message traffic. I would draft up a message, I have to send it out and get people to look at it. It's not people would sit on it for hours. And I would always wonder why it took so long. Well, it took so long because they had a lot of questions. So I tried to be more prepared to answer those questions and give them what they need to know first. Well, other things that you can do to reduce transportation waste is to schedule integration and deconfliction. And that's what Skip showed you. Skip showed you a lot of deconflicting. And so if you're in project management, you have your work management, your work breakdown structure. And Skip says, we used to allow employees to update their profiles in SharePoint. Yes, perfect. And that's a good way to do it. That's a good way to do the non-utilized talent to reduce that waste. But transportation, you use a work breakdown structure. And so you can help integrate what everybody's doing. You can look at processes, sit down and talk to each other. If you sit down in a room and you get a couple dry erase markers on a board, you can talk about where the waste is and how to reduce the time somebody has something in their place. Or you can tell them, okay, you need to take 5 minutes. It's all you get, 5 minutes. Or it has to be transported in 10 minutes. Or you have to make a decision, on this process in 30, whatever. Assign a time, make it a shall. Make it a shall statement, and you can reduce that waste. Okay, So inventory. Again, you got just in time and just in case. Um, so you just want to look at how you can reduce the inventory that you have going through your system. And this is a specific lack of flow because if you're ordering a bunch of supplies and you don't know where they're going to go, then why are you ordering them? And a lot of times people order things because they're afraid to not have them on hand. So we're going to look at this from a knowledge management standpoint. And one, you're going to know your suppliers because you can talk to your supplier and ask questions about how long does it take to get to me and how long does it take for you to produce it? How many people are asking for it? How often do you see these have to be replaced? Ask a lot of questions of your supplier because they can give you a lot of answers. But also create the workflow. If you create the workflow of timing, you can have it, so you don't have to have one person knowing who this customer is or who the supplier is. You can understand that, okay, the throughput for this part is this, and this is when I need to pay for this. This is how what the long lead time is on this, and how often I need to buy a replacement for it. So understanding the inventory waste is very important, but also understanding how to get around problems you're having through knowledge sharing and through discussions, through communication is going to be very important for you. Right. So motion. We're almost done here. So motion. Motion is not the same thing as transportation waste. And it's about the extra movements that cause loss of time. The extra movements where people make shuffle papers. You ever had the person who says, I'm going to go clean up my desk, and they just stack them to a different pile. They're not really doing anything. They're just wasting a lot of time. Or you have people who, hey, I'm going to move these products around to a different part of the warehouse. It's not still not getting the person that needs it, but they're thinking that, okay, I'm going to make it a lot easier for when it does come time. So what you can do with knowledge management to reduce motion is you can look at it and say, why am I doing this? Why is it important? Why is it necessary? Also, do the walk and talk. So do the Gemba walk and walk through the organization, find out, is there any unnecessary motion? Is there any unnecessary time that people are using to move stuff? Is there any unnecessary time in what decisions they're making to move stuff? You know, why do they do all these extra movements anyway? And so you can create a workflow for that, but get everybody familiar with workflow. Don't make it behind a locked safe or behind a place where you have to go into a SharePoint portal and get permission to use it. I'll tell you, there's nothing more frustrating to a user than saying, okay, I've been told it's here, but I can't access it. And then having to wait on somebody else to give you access to it, only to find out it's not the right material that you need. So, there's a lot of communication that has to happen, a lot of managing that knowledge that has to happen. Okay. So last waste, extra processing. And so we're not talking over production of waste. We're talking about when something is good enough as opposed to perfection. Because we've seen a lot of times where, if we have kids, our kids, we're telling them, okay, you need to do this, do it now. Well, I'm almost done. Well, almost done is sometimes good enough. So you got to look at what's good enough. And, we do this all the time with PowerPoint. You have staff that sit there and do PowerPoints all day long, and they want to have the perfect color code, the perfect font, yeah, get a template. Do your day real easy with that. So what you want to do is you want to read through what's already been produced and find out what will work for you. So I always recommend using templates, having a standard process, or hey, this is what we're going to do, and just update it. You don't have to create something special. No one's going to look back at 10 years and say, oh, they did a great PowerPoint. They're going to know that, hey, this person did good work and they did it on time. And because you want to do all things on time, on schedule, on cost, with good quality. And you don't want people to waste time making it perfect because in the end, I don't think I've ever been told, hey, great job. It's perfect. It looks great. It's great colors. I will say that I did have one admiral that walked out of meetings if he didn't do his color code, but guess what? We had things that were set up in our template for that color code. So we did it his way. And that's just exactly what you have to do. So reduce your extra processing by knowing what's acceptable. And that expression there, There wouldn't be state minimums if minimum was acceptable is absolutely correct. You got to know what is perfect and what is good enough, and don't strive for perfection. Subscribe to doing what needs to be done and what's good. Okay, so your key takeaways. And key takeaways is there's always more than one way to eliminate waste. I'm talking about the human-centric ways of doing business, human-centric knowledge management methods of reducing waste. But if you have another way to do it, do it. Just know there's options out there that not everybody has the only way to do it. There may be the best way, maybe the worst way, and there might be the good enough way. So you need to do what's good enough to get the job done. That's going to make the customer happy, as well as keep you from having to change you know puppies to little dogs. you know it's all good. All right, knowledge management practices are just one of those ways. If you have to do something project management related, knowledge is part of project management. And so you can come up with different way of doing it. If you do a process chart, or if you do a flow chart, if you do a matrix, a RACI chart, just any of those ways. And so you're going to find your way of doing it, whatever you're most comfortable with, whatever your organization wants you to do. You're going to find a balance. But just know that there are people out there that have done it before. You're not the first person to do something. And know that knowledge management is not practiced just through technology. A high believer in knowledge management must be human centric first, because if you don't have the person doesn't input to technology unless they know something. They can give information, put the data and the information into the tech, but if the tech breaks, guess what? You've got to drag out the pencil and paper and do the work yourself. So there's all sorts of things you can do with knowledge management. Like I said, I can talk to people a bit more about that on a different time. But if you have any questions for me, you can ask them now, or you can reach out to me. And again, you'll have this link. You'll have this PDF, and you'll get all these links and my email address. And if you find me on LinkedIn, you can also communicate through there, because I'm on LinkedIn every day. Okay. And Mark, I'm gonna quit sharing my screen so you can have the screen back.
Alrighty.
So stop sharing.
Yeah. So thanks for all of that, Cindy. It's
Sure.
really like that. The eight wastes concept. It kind of does a neat bundling of it's like you can, rather than looking at something and say this is all messed up. It's like, well, here's some specific areas to look at. One of those, I mean, a lot of them I think are really applicable when it comes to leadership of associations, membership associations. One that just like leaped off the screen for me was the non-utilized talent, or maybe even underutilized talent, as a huge waste. And I've seen this a lot with volunteers. So our PDCHR's constituency is always primarily volunteer-led, volunteer-run, volunteer-executed, volunteer participation. And so, like, one of the worst things we can do is when we solicit volunteers to, help out or be on this committee or whatever it is not having an understanding of their general capability and capacity up front. But even worse than that is not being able to put it to use, the moment they show up and say, all right, I am ready to do this as we agreed. Say, well, I need to get you this. I need to get you the access to the information. Or, well, I haven't really thought it out. There's no faster way to lose a volunteer, than a potential future leader than that. But I think all of the stuff, is pretty super. And I appreciate that clarification between transportation and emotion. This is kind of interesting, comparison there. Skip, made a comment there about using SharePoint, to allow employees or participants to share out their own profiles, but there's that great question, like, if you write it, will anyone read it?
Yeah. Well, it's never a guarantee either.
Right.
My last company, we stood up a knowledge, skills, and abilities matrix, and it went through several iterations. And what we did is we got together a small team of the leads, the leadership, what they're looking for, but also sent it out to everybody in the company. We were a small company at the time. It was about 500 people, and we got input for that, and that really helped because when it came to developing a proposal for other contracts, we could look back and say, yes, we hired the type of people, and that really helped them to get the right type of feedback for the proposal. Because you can't look at business development as the A team. You got to look at it as in being able to ask anybody to help you. And so knowledge, skills, and abilities really helped them because they could reach out to somebody who had worked for the customer that they're going after a job for, and they were able to develop that proposal a lot better.
We just started something like that at work. We're right in the very beginning stages of it. They identified very many categories, soft skills as well as hard skills, and background as well as what you think you're capable of, as opposed to just what you have experience in. And trying to get all the employees. I'm not sure how many people it's gone out to, but if it's all IT, it's at least 500 some people. And we're in the middle of collecting that data. It's going to be very interesting to see not only what it ends up looking like, but how they're going to make use of it. That's my biggest question, is who's going to be using it.
Yeah. So I was going to make one quick comment on the skill set tracking that we did in SharePoint that didn't actually start from the perspective of trying to track skills. That was an offshoot. At the time, I was working for a bank, and we had customers that potentially would call in from different countries around the world. We didn't have a way to track who could actually speak different languages. So we actually started creating a skills inventory for languages. And then had the ability to grow that out from there. So it just became one of those things. One, I mean, again, any of these, you got to make it simple, right? If this is one that
Yes.
could just go right to SharePoint search, pull up the search for employees and put in the skill set type that they were looking for. Maybe they didn't remember somebody and they couldn't remember. We were trying to make it easier so that if you didn't remember the name of the project manager, you could just search for project management and potentially scroll down and find those people. So anything that gave them the ability to self-identify, either from their job responsibilities or stuff they had from before. I mean, like I couldn't have told you who else could do business analysis in that company, but if the skill sets were filled out, I could search and find people that might be able to help with different types of work or key unique areas. So those are definitely, but yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the understanding the employee skill set, the larger the company, the harder it is to do that. It's too easy to kind of get separated into your own group and, kind of left there.
Yeah, and you can't fixate on somebody being in IT that they only know IT. You can't fixate on somebody in project management think they only know about project management. That's where these KSAs really do help, because you're able to ask them questions and also say, hey, let me know what else you do. What type of stuff do you do for volunteer work? Because stuff that Mark's team does, they have project management skills in there. When you're doing volunteer work, you're also doing marketing, you're doing advertising, you're doing communications planning, you're doing outreach. So there's a lot of stuff that happens there that may not happen in a business, but that can be turned to a business, or may allow the person to apply for other jobs in the company and maybe do a better job elsewhere if you know the knowledge, skills, and abilities. But I like to tell everybody that knowledge management is not just for business, it's for everything. We do knowledge management when we teach our kids how to make Rice Krispie treats. We do knowledge management when we teach people how to do skills like laundry. It's all around you, and that's kind of where the fun is in it, why I like it so much.
Yeah, going back to your wastes that you were mentioning, I'd always felt like it's a bit of a waste to be redundant. If I'm doing something and somebody else is doing something, like we had some major administration stuff a few years back, and two people sat there together doing it the whole time, and I felt like I needed to not participate, even though I wanted to. In some ways, I felt like I would pick up a lot of valuable knowledge. I wouldn't let myself because I didn't want to waste that time. But now we're more recently, we're embracing what we're calling ensemble working or ensemble programming if you're programming. But 3 of us sat yesterday working on a problem together, rather than in the past where it might have been one person, and then if they had questions, they would ask someone else. Now, we're still supposed to try and document everything that we're doing, because even though 3 of us did it together, 6 months from now, neither one of us will remember, or none of us will remember that we did it, much less what we learned. But
Yep.
at least we're making an attempt. And I've actually found the concept very valuable.
I'm glad you guys are doing that, because you may have an idea that somebody else may not be thinking about when you're doing something, or they
Yes.
may have experience doing it a different way. So, it's kind of like water cooler talk. You never know until somebody says, "Hey, I did this weekend." So you find out somebody jumped out of an airplane as a hobby, and then you say, "Well, why don't you talk about this? And why don't you give somebody a presentation about this and about safety?" Because they know a lot about safety jumping out of airplanes. So there's all sorts of things you can do to extrapolate what somebody else can do for your company by talking about what they do in their off time.
All right. Well, I just want to take this point to thank everybody for their participation today. Tricia, thank you for bringing ASQ in as a partner for today, and Cindy and Skip and Cindy for sharing a ton of insight that may be helpful for folks who are running membership associations, and certainly, hopefully, they can take some stuff back to whatever their day job is. I have just dropped into the chat box 4 links, 3 or 4 links there, a survey, and our next couple events. I'm going to ask everybody to just click on those links right now. Don't do anything with them except leave them up and deal with them later. Coming up next, to kind of wrap up our learning session today, on Tuesday, everybody who attended will receive an email thanking you for this, an opportunity for you to generate an attendance certificate if you want, and most significantly, we'll include a link to our resources page where you'll have access to the presentations and/or the presenters, for follow-up, as well as a list of those who attended and are willing to share their contact information if you want to chase folks down. So you will see that on Tuesday morning. As I said before, we do this all the time. There's at least one thing a month going on. Almost all are free, so I encourage you to share this with your friends if you liked it. And if you didn't like it, just share it with me. I'll take care of that. But that's never been the case. So again, thank you all for attending. We were scheduled to go to noon. It is 11:57. So my gift to you today is 3 minutes. Go forth and do well with it. So barring any hand waving, it was like, oh my God, I got one last thing out. We're gonna wrap. So I'm looking across the screen, and I think we're there. All right, thanks again, everybody. Hope to see you again. Our next event is Wednesday, September. Oh, nothing. Wednesday, nothing.
October.
Wednesday, October 5th. I said we do something every month, except I do planning in September. So there you go. All right, thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Mark.
All right.
Bye.
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 Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Hello.